Martha Peterson called Hannah so softly that at first she thought she was just imagining things. It was a bright afternoon in the old farmhouse. A warm strip of sunlight stretched across the wood-burning stove through the small window. Neatly folded linen towels rested on the wooden bench against the wall, and in the corner a tallow candle flickered quietly, placed there not out of fear, but to bring comfort to the ailing woman. Hannah was just lifting the clay pots of warm vegetable soup off the stove when a weak voice drifted from the bed. "Hannah, come closer, child." She quickly wiped her calloused hands on her checkered apron and leaned over her mother-in-law. Martha Peterson had grown terribly thin over the last few weeks, but her eyes remained sharp and attentive. "Would you like some water?" Hannah asked gently, "or maybe a bit of broth?" "It is not broth I need," whispered the old woman. "Call Ethan, and I wish Peter were here too." Hannah pressed her lips together tightly. The younger son had been away working out of state for years, and nobody knew if he would make it back in time. "Ethan sent word to him yesterday," she said softly. "As soon as the letter reaches him, Peter will travel home. God willing, it gets to him fast." Martha Peterson slowly shifted her gaze toward the whitewashed ceiling. "Because I do not want to leave this world while my boys are still strangers to each other." The heavy front door creaked open, and Ethan appeared in the threshold, tall and bone-tired, with dark shadows under his eyes. He had barely left the house for long stretches over the past few days, tending to the livestock, chopping firewood, and returning right back to his mother's bedside. "Ma, I am here," he said quietly. Martha Peterson reached out a dry, veiny hand toward him. "Son, take care of the homestead. Not just the physical walls, but the folks who will live inside it. For a house without agreement is not a true home, but a cold storage shed." Ethan leaned closer to the ticking clock. "Do not worry, Ma. Everything will be fine." "Do not speak so lightly," she whispered back. "After a person passes, folks often divide things that should never be split. They divide the clay pots, they divide the tillable acres, they divide the hearth itself, and then they tear their own hearts to pieces." Hannah instinctively crossed herself and smoothed the edge of the patched quilt. "There will be nothing of the sort, Ma. Who would ever fight around here? We're all family." Martha Peterson looked at her daughter-in-law long and hard, almost painfully. "You are a good woman, Hannah, but even goodness grows wary when it is never appreciated. Remember that." Silence settled over the farmhouse. Somewhere out in the farmyard, a rooster crowed, a horse-drawn wagon rattled past the wooden fence, and a thick log cracked deep within the iron stove. Hannah felt a sudden chill run down her spine, even though the afternoon was warm. "Perhaps you should rest now," she said softly. "I will rest," the old woman replied. "Only first, do not touch my wooden cedar chest without Peter. Do you hear me, Ethan?" "I hear you, Ma." Martha Peterson suddenly fell silent, as if her strength had abandoned her right in the middle of a word. "What was that about the chest?" Ethan leaned in closer. "That neighbour, Martha, comes by too often," the old woman barely managed to whisper. "Not everything that wears a friendly face brings actual goodness." Hannah and Ethan exchanged glances. Their neighbour Martha had been Martha Peterson's closest friend for many years, bringing herbal remedies, sitting by her bedside, and helping out whenever she could. It felt strange to hear such words now. "You are just exhausted, Ma," Ethan said cautiously. "We will talk about this later." Martha Peterson closed her eyes, her trembling fingers still clutching the edge of the cotton quilt. Hannah stood up and walked back to the stove, but her heart was no longer at ease. Late that afternoon, the neighbour Martha stepped into the cabin, carrying a small cloth bundle of dried field herbs. "How is she holding up?" the neighbour whispered. "Weak, but fully in her right mind." Martha walked right up to the bed, leaned over her ailing friend, and cast a remarkably sharp, lingering look at the old cedar chest sitting against the wall. Hannah noticed this odd glance, but did not think much of it at the time. On that day, everyone's minds were entirely consumed by the sick woman, and nobody yet knew that this very chest would soon spark a bitter family war. Several days had passed since Ethan dispatched a message with a traveling cattle drover heading toward the distant county where Peter was working. Every single morning, Ethan walked out to the front gate and stared down the dusty dirt road, hoping his brother might appear at any moment, but the highway remained empty. Martha Peterson grew weaker with each passing sunrise. Hannah barely left her side, offering sips of well water, fluffing pillows, and simmering light broths. But the relentless illness steadily drained the old woman's remaining vitality. That morning, bright sunlight flooded the farmyard. Farm hens scratched the dirt near the split-rail fence, and a heavy silence hung inside the cabin. Martha Peterson lay near the hearth, gazing endlessly out the small window as if waiting for someone to arrive. "Could you manage a spoonful of broth?" Hannah asked gently. "No, child," the old woman smiled faintly. "Broth is the last thing on my mind." She paused for a moment and suddenly added, "If only Peter would hurry." Hannah lowered her eyes, having thought the exact same thing every single day. The younger son had left for distant work years ago, visiting frequently at first, then less and less. Yet Martha Peterson had never stopped waiting for him. "He will come, Ma," Ethan said, pulling a wooden stool up beside the bed. "If the message reaches him, he will ride hard." Martha Peterson fixed her oldest son with a long, piercing look. "I know he will come. My only fear is that he will not find me breathing." Ethan turned away toward the window. For the very first time, Hannah saw a bright tear glint in his tired eyes. Toward evening, neighbor Martha dropped by again, bringing her usual bundle of dried herbs and a clay pitcher of medicinal tea. "How is our dear Martha doing?" she asked sympathetically. "Fading fast," Hannah replied. The neighbor sighed heavily and sat beside her friend's cot. "Stay strong, Martha. Peter still has time to get here." Martha Peterson stared at her with weary eyes. "God grant it." The neighbor stayed for a bit, chatted about the spring weather, the vegetable gardens, and village gossip, then headed back home. Nobody suspected anything unusual at the time, since she had acted as Martha Peterson's closest confidant for decades and visited constantly. As twilight began to swallow the countryside, the old woman unexpectedly beckoned Ethan and Hannah closer. Her voice had dropped to a mere whisper. "Listen to me closely and remember my words." They leaned in silently. "After I am gone, take care of one another. Do not guard the house, do not guard the tilled soil, do not guard the livestock, guard each other. Because when harmony leaves a family, no farmhouse in the world will ever keep you warm." Hannah felt a sharp pang in her chest. "Please do not talk like this, Ma." "I must speak, for my time is short." Martha Peterson closed her eyes for a brief moment, gathering her last reserves of breath. "Ethan, if Peter returns, hold no grudges against him. He was far away, but his heart never left this place." "I will not, Ma. Promise me." "I promise." Hearing this, the old woman finally relaxed and soon drifted off to sleep. Hannah checked on her several times throughout the night, and right before dawn, she realized Martha Peterson had drawn her final breath. She wept quietly and woke Ethan. The older son stood by his mother's bedside for a long time without uttering a single word. Only when the very first rays of morning sun touched the window pane did he step out into the farmyard. Standing beside the gnarled old apple tree, Ethan felt a profound, crushing loneliness for the very first time. Both parents were gone now, and an overwhelming desire washed over him for Peter to come back home as fast as humanly possible. Yet he did not know that his younger brother was already racing toward the village on a lathered horse, pushing the animal without rest, completely unaware of the heartbreaking truth waiting for him. Peter missed arriving by a single night, and a meeting lay ahead that would irrevocably alter the lives of everyone living beneath Martha Peterson's roof. Martha Peterson's funeral brought out nearly the entire township. From early morning, neighbors gathered in the front yard, speaking in hushed tones by the gate and offering condolences to Ethan and Hannah. The spring sun shone brilliantly, as if completely indifferent to human grief, while a gentle breeze rustled the leafy crowns of the tall trees shading the homestead. Hannah barely remembered those hours, constantly occupied with mourners, prayers, memorial foods, and the lingering phantom thought that Martha Peterson would any second now call out from the stove or ask for a dipper of water. Yet for the first time in many years, the cabin felt unnaturally, heavily silent. Just as the mourners began to disperse after the memorial dinner, a thick cloud of dust rose up down the gravel road. At first nobody paid it mind, but within moments a horseman came hurtling into view, driving his mount as if fleeing from mortal danger. Ethan was standing right by the open gate when he recognized his brother. "Peter," he whispered. Before the dust-covered horse even came to a complete halt, Peter vaulted out of the saddle. His face was hollowed out from relentless travel, his clothing caked in trail dust, and stark panic lived in his wide eyes. "Where is Ma?" he blurted out, skipping greetings entirely. Ethan stood in total silence. Peter swept his gaze across the people dressed in black mourning clothes, the long tables piled with leftover memorial dishes, and Hannah standing in tears by the doorway, and suddenly understood everything. He froze dead in the center of the yard. "No!" he gasped out. "No! I was hurrying!" Peter slowly sank down onto the wooden bench outside the house and buried his face in his rough hands. Hannah had never seen him look like this. The younger brother had always been loud, cheerful, and full of talk, but now he sat utterly mute, as if he had lost something far greater than just a mother. "I didn't make it in time," he repeated over and over, his voice cracking. "Just a few days short. If only that drover had found me sooner, if only I had ridden out immediately." Ethan placed a heavy hand on his brother's trembling shoulder. "Do not torture yourself. Ma knew you were coming back." "But she died completely alone." "She was not alone. We were right by her side." Peter remained silent for a long, agonizing minute, then finally lifted his head and caught sight of a young woman standing quietly beside the wagon. "Nancy, come over here," he called out. A slender, dark-haired girl timidly walked toward the yard. She was noticeably younger than Hannah and looked rather bewildered amidst the sea of unfamiliar faces. "This is my wife," Peter announced. "We got married 2 years ago." Ethan looked at his brother in stunned surprise. He had only heard brief mentions of a wife in scattered letters, but this was his first time seeing her in the flesh. "Come on inside the house," Hannah said gently, breaking the tension. "Do not stand out here in the open yard." Nancy offered a polite, respectful bow and whispered a quiet thank you. Later that evening, when the guests had finally departed for good, all 4 of them sat around the wooden kitchen table. It felt utterly strange. That very seat had always belonged to Martha Peterson, and now her place remained starkly empty. "We did not want to arrive like this," Peter murmured, staring down at his hands. "We planned to see Ma, to spend time with her, but instead—" He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. "The important thing is that you are finally back home," Ethan replied firmly. "A family belongs together." Nancy looked gratefully at her husband, but a shadow of deep anxiety flickered in her eyes. She understood perfectly well that they had returned without a house of their own and would now have to live right here in this established homestead where Hannah had reigned as absolute mistress for years. That night, everyone tried their best to be kind and accommodating, but deep down, each person already sensed that Martha Peterson's old house had suddenly become far too cramped for 2 separate families. And when Nancy stepped outside to fetch her personal belongings from the wagon, neighbor Martha intercepted her by the front gate with a knowing smirk. "So you must be Nancy, is that right?" the neighbor asked smoothly. "Yes, ma'am." "Well, it sure will be interesting to see how you manage living in this house." Nancy did not fully grasp the strange, barbed tone behind the words, but the older woman's remark lingered in her memory for a long time. The true, bitter meaning of that encounter would only become clear to her much later. The morning after the funeral, the sun rose over the village just as it always had, But for the inhabitants of the old farmhouse, everything felt fundamentally altered. Hannah woke up earlier than anyone else and sat quietly by the cold stove, staring at the empty space where Martha Peterson had rested until very recently. The house was dead silent, save for the faint clocking of chickens drifting in from the yard. Soon enough, however, that fragile quiet was broken by fresh voices outside. Nancy was already busy by the backyard well, while Peter helped unload their travel trunks into the storage shed. At breakfast, everyone made a conscious effort to behave warmly. Peter reminisced about his childhood, Ethan shared local news about the township, and Nancy listened intently. "Do you remember the time you tried to shoe that wild stallion all by yourself?" Ethan chuckled suddenly, flashing a grin. Peter immediately grew defensive. "Oh, do not start with that." "Why not? Nancy ought to know what a master horseman I have for a brother." "And what happened?" Nancy asked, her curiosity piqued. "Nothing special," Peter muttered defensively. "He is lying," Ethan laughed out loud. "The horse broke loose and chased him all over the farmyard." Nancy burst into loud, genuine laughter. "Is that the honest truth?" "Sadly, yes," Peter sighed. "And Ma told me afterward that I looked a whole lot more like that runaway horse than a proper farm master." Even Hannah cracked a genuine smile. For the first time in many long days, the old house echoed with carefree laughter. Following breakfast, the two women set to work together around the homestead. At first, everything went smoothly. Nancy helped carry water buckets, swept the front porch, and fed the morning poultry, genuinely trying to make herself useful without stepping on any toes. "You have got a steady hand at chores," Hannah remarked, watching Nancy polish off her tasks with impressive speed. "My mother always taught me that a lazy housewife brings ruin to even the grandest estate," Nancy replied cheerfully. "Well, your mother spoke the truth," Hannah agreed with an approving nod. Later on, the men joined them outside. Peter was busy fixing the old wooden gate that had sagged off its hinges for months. "There, that should stand for another 100 years," he declared proudly, driving the final wooden peg into the post. Ethan examined the gate with a skeptical eye.
"If it does not collapse by sundown, it might last." "Wanna bet on it?" Peter challenged with a laugh. "What are we betting?" "A whole bowl of farm-style dumplings." "Then you better start getting your apron on, little brother." Nancy merely shook her head in amusement. "I swear, neither of you ever truly grew up." "What would be the point?" Peter grinned. "This way is a whole lot more fun." Hannah smiled again. Watching the brothers banter back and forth, she felt something resembling true peace for the first time since her mother-in-law's passing. Martha Peterson had always dreamed of seeing her boys united, and now that wish had finally come true. Yet right around lunchtime, the first tiny friction occurred, a minor incident that could easily have been forgotten, but for some reason stuck in both of their minds. Hannah had set a large clay bowl of raised bread dough right next to the warm brick of the stove and stepped outside to split kindling. When she returned, the bowl had been moved to the opposite corner. "I shifted it over slightly," Nancy smiled warmly. "It is warmer there. The dough will rise much better." "I always place it right here," Hannah replied, her voice maintaining an even, level tone. "Oh, please forgive me, I only meant to help." Hannah offered a polite nod, but an unpleasant sediment settled deep inside her chest. It was such a trivial thing, entirely insignificant, yet it made her remember that Martha Peterson had never once rearranged anybody else's kitchenware without explicit permission. By evening, neighbor Martha strolled into the yard, bringing a small cloth sack of dried apples and immediately launching into her usual routine. "Well, how are you folks getting along under one roof now?" she asked with an ingratiating smile. "Just fine, thank God," Nancy answered quickly. "Splendid," the neighbor nodded, her eyes darting around. Families need to stick together, especially after enduring such a heavy loss." Everyone agreed. That evening they sat together outside the farmhouse as the sun dipped below the rolling fields, chatting about ordinary, mundane matters. It seemed as though daily life was slowly sliding back into its normal groove. Nobody suspected any looming conflicts. Nobody gave a single thought to dividing the stove, the pantry, or the vegetable patch. Everyone was fully convinced they could peacefully coexist under one roof. And yet, precisely on that day, the very first tiny seed of resentment had been planted, and none of them knew yet that it would eventually grow into a devastating catastrophe for the entire household. Several days had slipped by since the arrival of Peter and Nancy, and life in the old farmhouse had settled into a steady daily rhythm. Every morning before sunrise, the men marched off to labor in the fields, while the women stayed behind to manage the domestic chores. Nancy genuinely tried to pull her weight in every single task. She hauled well water, fed the laying hens, swept the hard-packed dirt yard, and enthusiastically tackled any chore assigned to her. Hannah noticed this diligence and repeatedly caught herself thinking that the younger sister-in-law was far from lazy or spoiled. On the contrary, she actively sought ways to be helpful and never once complained about the cramped quarters or daily inconveniences. That particular morning, the two women were scrubbing laundry together down by the deep stone well. The spring sun was already beating down warmly on the rich soil, and swallows looped through the air above the garden patches. "You have got such a lovely place out here," Nancy observed, hanging a heavy linen sheet up on the rope clothesline. "Peter told me so many stories about the homestead, but I never imagined it was quite this cozy." "Martha Peterson cherished this house with all her heart," Hannah answered, pinning another cloth. "She knew every single wooden plank by its first name." "Peter spoke of his mother constantly along the trail," Nancy murmured softly. "He still cannot forgive himself for not making it back in time." Hannah lowered her gaze. "We all wished he could have arrived sooner, but what use is dwelling on the past now?" Nancy nodded, and for a few quiet minutes they worked side by side in companionable silence. For the first time in many days, the heavy tension between them lifted. Instead, they were slowly starting to get used to each other's presence. When the men finally trudged back home at dusk, a hearty supper was already waiting on the wooden table. "Now that smells heavenly," Peter shouted out as soon as he crossed the threshold. "Sounds like we've got two master cooks in the house instead of just one. Does that scare you, big brother?" Nancy teased with a playful grin. "Not yet," Ethan joked back. "Nancy, do not stuff him quite so full." "Why ever not?" she asked in mock surprise. "Because if Peter gains another pound, we are going to have to build a brand new bench for him to sit on." "Won't be necessary," Peter laughed. "You are just plain jealous of my healthy appetite." "Oh, I am not jealous of your appetite. I am just amazed that your work trousers still button up after you eat like a thresher." Laughter erupted around the supper table. Even Hannah could not hold back a broad smile. After the meal finished, the men stepped outside to sit on the low wooden porch stoop. The evening air remained pleasantly warm, the sun slowly melting behind the horizon, and the daytime noises of the village gradually died away. "Remember when we snuck over and raided the neighbor's orchard for walnuts?" Ethan asked out of nowhere. "We didn't raid it, we scavenged," Peter protested, bursting into laughter. "See, even Hannah remembers." "I certainly never stole anything," Peter feigned indignation. "The tree branches hung right over the fence line, and then you ran away from the landowner so fast you lost both your boots in the creek," Nancy cackled loudly. "So that is why you hate talking about your childhood." "It is because everyone in this family possesses a terrifyingly good memory," Peter groaned playfully, throwing his hands up. "Especially my older brother." The conversation meandered on for a long time, drifting through old childhood memories, youthful escapades, and forgotten mischief. Hannah watched the brothers and vividly recalled how distressed Martha Peterson used to be during the long years of separation, constantly terrified that her boys would grow entirely estranged. Seeing them side by side once more brought a deep, quiet gladness to her soul. The very next day, the two women decided to bake loaves of sourdough bread together. Everything started off cordially, but when Nancy reached for one of the large earthenware mixing bowls, Hannah abruptly spoke up. "You better not use that one." "Why not?" Nancy asked, blinking in surprise. "I always mix my bread dough in this specific vessel." Nancy instantly set the bowl back down on the shelf. "All right, my mistake, I didn't know." Hannah had no desire to pick a fight either, but a strange nagging unease lingered in the pit of her stomach. Yesterday it was a pot, today it was a mixing bowl. And even though Nancy had committed no actual wrongdoing, Hannah felt a growing sense that the established order of her household was slowly shifting beneath her feet. Toward evening, neighbor Martha paid another visit to the yard, bringing along a gift of dried orchard apples and spending a long time reminiscing about the late Martha Peterson. "She was a good, solid woman," the neighbor declared reverently. "You would be hard-pressed to find another like her nowadays." "That's the absolute truth," Hannah agreed. "She always made peace between folks." "Well, the two of you need to guard that peace just as fiercely," neighbor Martha smiled smoothly. "Family is worth far more than any timber roof over your head." Nobody paid any special attention to her cryptic words at the time. Everyone remained fully convinced they had nothing to quarrel about. Yet by the very next morning, over something as trivial as a kitchen utensil, the first genuine flash of resentment would flare up between the two sisters-in-law, a grievance neither of them would forget any time soon. The following morning, after the previous evening's jokes and reminiscences, the farmhouse filled right back up with familiar domestic labor. The men headed out to the fields before the sun crested the horizon, leaving Hannah and Nancy to manage the homestead. The morning hours passed quietly enough. The women sorted apples for winter drying, organized medicinal herbs up in the dusty attic, and prepared for the approaching autumn season. Nancy tried diligently to lend a hand wherever she could, and Hannah found herself increasingly thinking that her younger sister-in-law truly possessed a strong work ethic.
"You do lovely embroidery work," Hannah noted, pausing to examine a decorative cotton hand towel Nancy had been stitching during the evenings. "My mother taught me how when I was just a little girl." "Oh, my very first embroidered towel looked positively frightening," Hannah laughed softly. "The floral patterns came out so crooked that Martha Peterson laughed until she cried." Nancy giggled along. "So you weren't an instant master artisan either, huh?" "Heavens no, I ruined plenty of good linen cloth before I finally got the hang of the stitches." Both women smiled, and for a fleeting moment Hannah truly believed that living together under one roof might prove far easier than she had originally feared. Around midday, they decided to brew a pot of traditional dried fruit compote. Nancy reached for a large clay crock sitting high on the pantry shelf and was about to pour well water into it when Hannah suddenly snapped, "Not that one!" Nancy turned around, looking entirely bewildered. "What is wrong with it?" "Martha Peterson always boiled milk in that specific vessel. I refuse to use it for anything else." "Oh, I am terribly sorry. I didn't know." Nancy immediately returned the crock to its shelf and grabbed a different one instead. On the surface, everything remained calm, but Hannah felt a familiar spike of irritation pierce her chest. Yesterday a mixing bowl, today a clay crock. Every single day she felt forced to explain where everything was kept and what its precise purpose was. Later on, the women stepped outside into the farmyard to hang up the wet laundry. "Everything around here seems to have its own hidden history, doesn't it?" Nancy smiled good-naturedly. "What do you mean by that?"
Oh, just things like that clay crock, or the porch bench, or the old cedar chest. Everyone has a story about every little object because you folks have lived here for so many years," Hannah replied.
I understand that, but sometimes I feel like I'm constantly terrified of messing something up. Hannah wanted to offer a comforting reply, but the words stuck in her throat because deep down she knew Nancy was entirely right. When evening rolled around, the men trudged back. Peter hauled a heavy armload of split firewood, looking extraordinarily pleased with himself. "Now that is what I call a real farm master," he proclaimed, dumping the logs neatly against the wall. "A real farm master spent a solid half-hour this morning searching all over the yard for his own axe," Ethan countered instantly. "I was not searching." "Then who was yelling my name for help across the homestead?" "Do not air our dirty laundry in front of the wives." Nancy burst into bright laughter, and Hannah reluctantly cracked a smile as well. Just a few days earlier, she had taken joy in watching the brothers grow close again, but now she increasingly noticed that since Peter's return, the house no longer belonged exclusively to her and Ethan. At supper, everyone ate together in subdued quiet. The conversation remained polite, but Hannah grew more and more silent. She could not properly explain why such tiny details suddenly grating on her nerves. Nancy wasn't picking fights, wasn't acting lazy, and wasn't being insolent. On the contrary, she actively tried to be kind. And that exact fact was what threw Hannah off balance the most, because there was nothing tangible to take offense at, yet her inner anxiety swelled with every passing hour. When everyone finally retired to bed, Hannah stared up at the dark wooden ceiling for a long time. She reminisced about the years spent alongside Martha Peterson, recalling how she herself had first arrived at this very farmhouse as a young, terrified bride decades ago. But back then, there had only been one true mistress of the house. Now there were two. And for the very first time, Hannah faced the terrifying realization that since Peter's return, she no longer felt like the sole queen of her domain. The thought shook her so profoundly that sleep eluded her for hours. And by the very next day, a completely innocent conversation concerning the vegetable garden would ignite the first genuine fracture between the two women. The following morning, the sun climbed into the clear sky, warm and bright. After days of shared living, it seemed as though the family was finally finding some common ground. The men left for the distant fields before dawn, leaving Hannah and Nancy to take care of the homestead chores. At first, everything went along as usual. The women hauled water together, fed the squawking chickens, and worked the vegetable garden beds. Nancy pitched in eagerly, while Hannah showed her where everything grew and how specific plants required tending. After the midday meal, Nancy picked up a heavy garden hoe and walked around to the back of the house. A small patch of cleared ground lingered right by the split-rail fence. She had been eyeing that particular spot for days, deciding it would make an ideal plot to plant some fresh dill and green onions for the upcoming autumn. Nancy was right in the middle of breaking up the packed soil when Hannah stepped around the corner. "What on earth are you doing?" she demanded. "I just wanted to plant some dill. This looks like a nice patch of earth." Hannah froze dead in her tracks. Martha Peterson always planted her winter runner beans right here. Nancy immediately straightened her back, dropping the hoe slightly. "I didn't know." "Well, now you know." Nancy silently lowered her eyes to the dirt. She had grown accustomed to such corrections by now, but for some reason this specific instance felt deeply wounding. "Hannah, where am I actually allowed to plant anything around here?" "Anywhere you like, but it seems every single inch of ground already holds a memory." Hannah offered no further response. She knew perfectly well that Nancy's words weren't far from the truth. For Hannah, every single square foot of the farmyard was bound up with sacred memories. Right here, Martha Peterson had dried her sliced apples. Right there, her favorite flowers bloomed. and right beside it sat the old resting bench. But to Nancy, it was merely a strange farmyard where she desperately tried to carve out a tiny space to call her own. The remainder of the day passed in dead silence between the two women. Only toward dusk did the mood in the yard lighten slightly. Peter returned from the fields, carrying a couple of raw timber planks slung across his broad shoulder. "This time, this pantry shelf is going to be laser level," he declared with supreme confidence. "That is precisely what you said about the front gate," Nancy teased with a smirk. "And what happened to it? It sagged completely off-center within 2 days." "That was the wind's fault, obviously." "Naturally, the wind is always to blame when your carpentry fails." Ethan burst out laughing. "Don't argue with him, Nancy. Ever since he was a little boy, he always blamed the wind for his mistakes because the wind never talks back." Even Hannah let out a quiet chuckle. For one brief moment, everything felt just as it had days prior. The family sat together outside the farmhouse. The men traded gentle insults, and the evening sun painted the farmyard in molten gold. Yet, as the laughter faded, Nancy once again broached the subject of the garden in her own head. She looked at the weathered old farmhouse and suddenly realized she still owned nothing of her own here, not because anyone actively forbade it, but because she constantly lived in terror of stepping on someone else's toes. Later on, when everyone gathered around the supper table, Peter casually dropped an announcement. "We are going to need to build another storage shelf in the pantry this autumn to hold our personal belongings." Nancy brightened visibly at the words. That would be wonderful. But Hannah felt a sharp, unpleasant twist in her gut at the phrase, "our personal belongings." Just 2 little words, yet for some reason they forced her to realize once again that this house no longer belonged exclusively to her and Ethan. That night, neither sister-in-law found sleep easily. Nancy pondered whether she would ever truly belong in this household, while Hannah wrestled with the question of whether she could ever stomach sharing Martha Peterson's old house with another mistress. And right on the heels of these dark thoughts, the ordinary kitchen stove, the very hearth where they had prepared meals side by side for years, would unexpectedly become the spark of their first real open warfare. The morning after the garden discussion, both women woke up with a heavy, bitter sediment clouding their hearts. No one shouted or screamed openly, but the previous ease between them had utterly vanished. At breakfast, they spoke exclusively about farm chores, and once the men departed for the fields, an awkward, suffocating silence settled over the kitchen. Nancy began preparing the midday meal earlier than usual. Deciding to cook a traditional pot of cabbage borscht following her own mother's cherished recipe, she slid the heavy clay pot right into the mouth of the brick stove. Right at that moment, Hannah walked into the kitchen. Spotting the blazing fire inside the stove, she stopped dead. "You already fired up the stove?" "I wanted to get an early start on dinner so I could finish up the garden work before dark." Hannah stared at the pot in dead silence. "I was planning on baking our weekly bread loaves today." "Well, go ahead and bake. There is plenty of room inside the brick oven." "Not right now. If the stove remains roaring hot from your borscht, my bread dough will never rise properly." Nancy sighed, visibly holding her tongue. "I didn't know." "Lately, there seems to be an awful lot of things you don't know." Nancy snapped her head up, her eyes flashing. "Just what exactly are you trying to insinuate with that tone?" "Nothing at all, except that this house has its own established rules, and I am exhausted from having to guess them for you every single day." Hannah slammed a wooden water bucket down against the floorboards. "Nobody is asking you to guess anything. Then why does it always turn out that I am doing everything completely wrong?" Following that outburst, a suffocating quiet filled the room. Hannah herself could not fathom why she was reacting with such bitter fury. Nancy worked just as hard as she did, never slacked off, and never used vulgar language. But every single tiny shift happening in the house felt like a personal wound, as if someone was slowly stripping away her familiar life. "I just want everything to go back to the way it used to be," Hannah whispered, her voice trembling. Nancy offered a bitter, humorless smile. "And I just want to feel like I actually belong here for once in my life." For the very first time, both women voiced the exact thoughts they had bottled up for weeks, but instead of bringing mutual understanding, it only made the atmosphere heavier. They barely spoke a single word to one another for the rest of the day. When the men returned from the fields at dusk, they instantly sensed the thick, toxic tension in the air. "What happened now?" Peter asked, dropping his tools. "Nothing at all," Nancy forced out quickly. "Your famous nothing at all strikes again," Ethan chuckled, trying desperately to lighten the mood. "If this keeps up, I'm going to have to start interviewing each of you in separate rooms." Nobody cracked a smile. Ethan exchanged a grim look with his brother. Both men understood that the trouble ran much deeper than a simple spat. During supper, Nancy kept her eyes glued down in her bowl, while Hannah refused to lift her gaze from the wood-grained table. Even neighbor Martha, who dropped by briefly to deliver a message, blinked in shock at the stony quiet. "You folks look mighty gloomy tonight," she observed. "Just a heavy day of labor," Hannah replied curtly. "You better guard your peace while you still have it," the neighbor warned cryptically, leaning against the doorframe. "Trouble always starts over the smallest of trifles, and before you know it, folks forget what they were even fighting about in the first place." At the time, nobody gave her words a second thought. Yet that very evening, the first true, unbridgeable crack appeared between the two women. Still small, almost invisible, but by the next morning, a bizarre and chilling discovery out by the storage shed would turn that tiny crack into a yawning chasm. Nancy woke up before dawn. Sleep had eluded her almost entirely throughout the turbulent night. She had lay awake for hours, listening to the embers crackling in the stove and chewing over Hannah's harsh words. Her rational mind understood that the older woman wasn't actively trying to evict her, but her wounded heart stubbornly whispered otherwise. It simply felt like she was constantly being told she didn't belong. Desperate to outrun her heavy thoughts, Nancy finally got dressed and stepped out into the crisp morning air. The dawn was crystal clear. A light veil of mist clung to the vegetable garden, and the distant shouts of villagers working their fields drifted across the valley. Nancy walked toward the storage shed to fetch a small canvas sack of dried orchard apples. Pulling the heavy wooden door open, she bent down toward the lower shelf and froze. Right across the wooden threshold lay a strange, disturbing object. At first glance, it resembled a mere clump of dried straw, but upon closer inspection, she saw a coarse black thread wrapped tightly around the straw in a deliberate criss-cross pattern. Nancy stopped breathing entirely. In her childhood, she had heard plenty of old wives' tales from village elders warning that such sinister bundles were deliberately left behind by malicious people trying to sow hatred or invite disaster into a peaceful household. Back then, she had scoffed at such superstitions. Right now, laughing was the furthest thing from her mind. Carefully, with trembling fingertips, she lifted the ominous object and felt a cold shiver race down her spine. Right at that exact second, footsteps crunched behind her, and Hannah stepped into the shed. "What is going on out here?" she asked. Nancy silently pointed down at the straw. Hannah's brow furrowed deeply. "Where did you dig that up?" "Right here across the threshold." The older woman picked up the bundle, inspected the tight black thread with narrowed eyes, and tossed it back down. "Probably some neighborhood kids playing a prank. There are no children living near this side of the farm. Maybe the wind blew it inside." Nancy shook her head vigorously. "The wind doesn't tie knots with black thread, Hannah." Hannah offered no reply. Deep down, a sickening wave of unease rippled through her, though she stubbornly refused to show it. Just throw it in the trash and forget about it. Easy for you to say. Nancy tucked the sinister bundle away inside an old clay jug and forced herself back to work, but her thoughts spun in frantic circles all day long. Every few minutes she caught herself glancing nervously over her shoulder. Her common sense told her it was just a pile of worthless straw, yet her pounding heart squeezed in sheer terror. Toward evening, she finally broke down and told Peter about it. "A bundle of straw tied with thread," her husband repeated, raising an eyebrow. "And that is what has you so worked up? You know just as well as I do what the villagers say about such things." "People in the countryside talk a lot of nonsense," Peter laughed gently, wrapping his strong arms around her shoulders. "Stop letting your imagination run wild." Nancy nodded, but true calm refused to settle over her spirit. And that very evening, a fresh, unsettling event took place. When she set about mixing the flour dough for the next day's bread, she plunged her hands into the wooden kneading trough and immediately recoiled. An excessive, heavy amount of salt had been dumped right into the flour. Nancy tasted a pinch and instantly spat it out with a grimace. "What is wrong?" Hannah asked, walking over. "Someone dumped an ungodly amount of salt into the flour." Hannah stepped closer, peering into the trough. "Perhaps you misjudged the amount yourself. I could never accidentally pour that much salt. Everyone makes mistakes sometimes." Nancy bit her tongue, but a fresh spike of pain pierced her chest. First the bizarre bundle of straw, now ruined baking flour, and every single time the only other person anywhere near the kitchen was Hannah. That night, sleep refused to visit her eyes once more. Peter snored softly beside her, while Nancy lay staring wide-eyed into the pitch-black darkness. For the very first time, a dark suspicion crossed her mind, one she instantly tried to banish, but which stubbornly crept back into her thoughts. What if these malicious little tricks weren't the work of some random outsider? What if someone living right under this exact roof actively wanted her gone? And for the first time, Nancy confronted the very thought she had been too terrified to entertain. If someone was deliberately planting these spooky items inside the home, that person had to be living alongside her day in and day out. And by the following morning, that festering suspicion would grow infinitely stronger. Ever since discovering the bound straw bundle, Nancy could no longer brush off these bizarre accidents as mere coincidences. She desperately tried to convince herself it was all childish nonsense, but every single time she walked past the storage shed or crossed the wooden threshold, the memory of that black thread made her stomach knot up in dread. During her childhood, she had listened to countless campfire stories about magical hexes, malicious neighbors, and spiteful relatives. Back then, it all sounded like old wives' tales meant to frighten children. Now humor had completely drained from the situation. That morning, the men left for the fields before the first rooster crowed. Hannah busied herself out in the garden, while Nancy remained inside the farmhouse to clean. She dusted the wooden shelves, reorganized the clothes chest, and forced herself to stay constantly occupied to keep her mind off yesterday's horrors. But when she lifted one of Peter's favorite work shirts from the bottom of the cedar chest, she froze mid-motion. A long, perfectly straight slash cut right across the side of the fabric. Nancy slowly traced her fingertips over the severed threads, feeling her entire insides plunge into an icy abyss. This wasn't just any old shirt. She had sewn it herself during long winter nights before their wedding, pouring her love into every single stitch. She remembered the exact pattern, the specific color of the thread, and how proudly Peter had worn it to the seasonal village fair, joking that it made him look wealthier than the local township mayor. And now someone had deliberately mutilated it. "Hannah!" she cried out, her voice sharp. The older woman hurried into the cottage, immediately noting Nancy's deathly pale complexion. "What happened?" Nancy silently thrust the slashed garment toward her. Hannah took the fabric into her hands, staring in disbelief. "How on earth did this happen?" That is precisely what I want to know. Hannah examined the cloth closely, her face tightening. Maybe it caught on a stray nail or a knife blade by accident. No. Why are you so certain? Because I folded it away completely intact yesterday evening. A heavy, suffocating silence descended upon the kitchen. Maybe a field mouse chewed through it? A mouse chews ragged holes, Hannah. This is a clean, deliberate knife slash. Hannah offered no further words. She could see quite clearly that the cut was far too straight and neat to be accidental, but she stubbornly refused to voice her realization. I honestly don't know, Nancy. Well, I am beginning to think someone in this house desperately wants to inflict pain on me. Hannah's eyebrows crashed together. What exactly are you implying? I am not implying anything. Then say what you mean right to my face. I don't want to start a war. Yet you constantly look at me as if you've already found me guilty of high treason. Nancy kept her mouth shut, and that exact silence was what wounded Hannah more deeply than any accusation could have. By dusk, they were still refusing to speak to one another. When the men walked back from the fields, Peter instantly sensed that the domestic atmosphere had plummeted to freezing temperatures. What is the matter this time? He sighed heavily. Nancy wordlessly dropped the slashed shirt onto the wooden table in front of him. Peter stared at the clean cut for a long, agonizing moment. Who did this? I don't know, but someone in this house certainly did, she replied quietly. Peter dragged his calloused palm across the damaged fabric, deep sorrow washing over his features. He remembered that shirt just as well as Nancy did. Such a waste, was all he managed to mutter. Ethan inspected the slash as well, his expression darkening. That is no accident. Nothing is an accident anymore, Nancy shot back bitterly. First the straw, now the shirt. Nobody could muster a response. During the evening meal, conversation failed entirely. Even the brothers' usual light-hearted banter vanished into thin air. Everyone chewed in grim silence, each person harboring the exact same dark thoughts, yet nobody dared to voice them aloud. Later, when everyone went to their respective sleeping corners, Nancy lay awake for hours. She replayed every bizarre incident of the past few weeks in her head. The straw, the black thread, the slashed shirt, Hannah's cold glances, her defensive words, her obvious resentment. And for the very first time, Nancy confronted the ultimate terrifying thought. If someone was purposefully smuggling these eerie items into the home, that person had to be living directly under the same roof. And tomorrow morning, right by the front threshold, a brand new, hair-raising discovery would appear, one that would make this horrifying suspicion an absolute certainty. Dawn broke early, painting the village in pale amber light. Nancy woke up feeling utterly drained, having slept not a wink. Outside, the weather remained calm and serene, the familiar clucking of farm hens echoing across the yard, while the first rays of sunlight pierced the small window pane. She quietly got dressed and stepped out into the yard to fetch the morning water bucket. But before she could take more than 3 steps, she froze in her tracks. Right across the wooden threshold lay another small pile of straw bound tightly with a coarse black thread, and jammed directly into the center of it was a rusted antique sewing needle. Nancy felt the blood instantly drain from her fingertips. This time there was zero room to write it off as a freak coincidence or a natural occurrence. She scooped up the straw and hurried back inside the farmhouse on trembling legs. "Hannah!" Her voice shook violently. The older woman stepped out from the kitchen nook, instantly spotting the sinister object in her hand. "Where did you find that?" "Right across the front door." Hannah's face turned ashen. Even she could no longer pretend this was just the wind or a childish prank. "We need to burn this immediately," Nancy said, her voice laced with panic. "But who is doing this to us?" Hannah remained silent. For the first time, she felt the exact same paralyzing dread that had haunted Nancy for days. Previously, she had convinced herself the younger woman was merely prone to hysteria. Now, absolute doubt had erased her skepticism. By midday, both brothers had been informed of the new discovery. Peter angrily turned the rusted needle over and over in his calloused palm. Whoever is doing this clearly has too much time on their hands. "This isn't a laughing matter, Peter," Nancy snapped. "I am not laughing. I just refuse to put stock in all these old country curses. And what if someone is deliberately planting them to terrorize us?" Ethan joined the conversation, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. "Then we need to figure out who it is, and fast." The conversation died out, but the toxic tension clung to the walls like thick smoke. By evening, neighbor Martha strolled into the yard. Spotting their gloomy faces from the gate, she immediately sauntered over to inquire about the cause. Nancy could no longer restrain herself and thrust the straw bundle right into the neighbor's face. The older woman stared at the object for a long time before slowly shaking her head. "That is an evil thing to see." "So you agree this is a deliberate hex?" Nancy demanded. "People do all sorts of wicked things out of pure, festering jealousy," neighbor Martha answered evasively. "But you folks really ought to stop fighting amongst yourselves. When a family starts tearing itself apart, evil only grows stronger." Hannah nodded numbly, though the neighbor's words left her feeling even more unsettled than before. That night around the supper table, the atmosphere felt charged with electricity. Nancy barely touched her food. Hannah remained uncharacteristically mute. Only the brothers attempted to keep up a semblance of normal conversation. But when Nancy accidentally locked eyes with Hannah across the dishes, the dark thought flared up in her mind once again with terrifying clarity. If an outsider isn't doing this, who living right here possesses the strongest motive to drive her out of this house? The very thought filled Nancy with immediate shame. Yet the more bizarre occurrences piled up, the harder it grew to suppress that burning question. And the following morning, an innocent conversation down by the well would push her closer to suspecting Hannah above all others. The next morning, Nancy walked down to the stone well before the sun fully cleared the rooftops. Following yesterday's horrifying discovery, her nerves were completely frayed, and she desperately craved a few moments of solitude. She had just hoisted a heavy wooden bucket of well water to the rim when she overheard the hushed voices of two local women standing by the fence line just beyond the bushes. They hadn't noticed her arrival. "Did you catch a glimpse of Peter's new bride lately?" one woman whispered. "I sure did. She's a mighty fine-looking girl." "Fine-looking, sure, but what sensible housewife is ever truly thrilled when another woman moves into her established home?" Nancy froze in her tracks, the bucket handle slipping slightly in her grip. "Still, she seems like a pleasant enough lady." "Pleasant, maybe, but there is only one farmhouse here. Even real sisters would scratch each other's eyes out over less." Nancy waited to hear no more. She heaved the heavy water bucket up onto her shoulder and marched back toward the yard in grim silence. The words were simple, yet they struck a raw nerve because she herself had been circling that exact same painful truth for days. When she stepped back into the yard, Hannah was already tending to the stove. "You were gone quite a while," the older woman noted without looking up. "There were folks gossiping down by the well." Hannah merely grunted in acknowledgement, while Nancy stared at her with new, evaluating eyes. Was it genuinely possible that all these bizarre, malicious tricks were happening simply because of the house? Because she and Peter had returned and claimed a share of the roof? The two women barely exchanged a word for the rest of the day, each trapped entirely within her own turbulent mind. After the midday meal, Nancy decided to retrieve a festive, embroidered wedding towel she had packed away in the bottom of the cedar chest. But upon lifting the heavy wooden lid, she noticed the folded linen did not sit quite right. At first she assumed her memory was playing tricks on her, but when she pulled the textile into the light, her breath caught in her throat. Right along the delicate hem ran a fresh, deliberate scissor slash, small but unmistakably visible. A hot wave of blinding rage surged through Nancy's chest. This wasn't a work shirt, and it wasn't baking flour. This was a treasured heirloom she had preserved with absolute devotion for years. She marched straight out to the farmyard and tracked Hannah down near the chicken coop. Was this an accident too? Nancy thrust the ruined wedding towel directly into her face. Hannah stared down at the slash in stunned bewilderment. I never even laid eyes on that towel today. Well, someone certainly laid eyes on it. You are pointing that finger at me again. And just who else am I supposed to suspect? Hannah straightened up defensively, her jaw set.
Someone who actually did it, but it sure as hell wasn't me. Right, just like the straw, just like the salted flour, just like the slashed shirt. Enough, Hannah roared, raising her voice in anger for the very first time. Nancy snapped her mouth shut. They stood facing each other in the middle of the dusty yard, both breathing heavily. Right at that precise moment, the front gate creaked open, and Ethan and Peter returned from the fields. The brothers instantly recognized the charged atmosphere of a fresh battle. "What is the problem now?" Peter asked, his voice laced with pure exhaustion. Nancy wordlessly held out the ruined wedding towel for him to see, while Hannah experienced a sudden surge of not just anger, but stark, unadulterated fear. Because if these malicious attacks kept escalating, soon nobody would believe a single word she uttered. And the most terrifying part of it all was that even Hannah herself was starting to entertain a dark thought. If it isn't Nancy, and it certainly isn't me, then who on earth is wandering around our homestead and leaving nothing but ruin in their wake? Following the screaming match over the slashed wedding towel, an eerie, tomb-like silence settled over the old farmhouse. Nancy no longer bothered to hide her burning suspicions, and Hannah was thoroughly exhausted from defending her innocence against invisible enemies. Peter held the ruined textile in his rough hands for a long time, carefully studying the deliberate cut in the fabric. He knew how dearly Nancy treasured this specific piece, having watched her stitch it during long winter evenings long before they ever moved back to the township. This was done on purpose, he finally concluded. "I told you so," Nancy whispered bitterly. Hannah slammed a heavy iron skillet down onto the wooden table with a loud clatter. "And once again, your immediate assumption lands squarely on my shoulders." "Well, who else is there?" Nancy retorted, her voice cracking with emotion. "We don't live out here with the entire township. So you've already decided I am the guilty party? Who else could it possibly be?" Hannah turned deathly pale from the sheer injustice of the accusation. "I would never stoop to such wickedness. And I am completely out of things to believe in anymore." Ethan stood up abruptly, knocking his wooden stool backward. "Enough of this! Both of you shut your mouths right now!" Silence fell instantly, but the poisonous words had already been spoken aloud. After dinner, the brothers retreated to the storage shed to fix a broken roof rafter. They worked in heavy, unbroken silence for a long time, the only sounds being the scraping of timber and the dull thud of a carpenter's mallet. Finally, Peter broke the quiet. Nancy wouldn't make up something like that. Ethan didn't even look up from his chisel. And Hannah wouldn't go around destroying other people's belongings. "Are you honestly that certain?" "Aren't you?" Peter tossed his hammer down onto the workbench. "Too many bizarre things have been happening lately, Ethan. And that makes you instantly ready to believe my own wife is capable of such malice?" "I didn't say that." "No, but you sure as hell thought it." An impenetrable wall of silence dropped between the brothers, one far heavier than any shouted argument. "You know what hurts the most?" Ethan murmured, staring at the dirt floor.
"I waited so long for you to come back home. I wanted to come back just as badly. And now we are at each other's throats over things that should never come between us." Peter lowered his gaze. Suddenly, a flood of childhood memories washed over him, running down to the river together, hiding from sudden summer thunderstorms inside towering haystacks, getting jointly scolded by their mother for pulling pranks. The realization made his chest ache fiercely. "I have no desire to fight with you, brother." "Then don't. But don't you ever sit there and let your wife accuse Hannah without a shred of proof." Peter offered no reply. By the time they walked back into the farmhouse at dusk, the women instantly perceived that something fundamental had shifted between the brothers. Supper passed in total silence. No one joked, no one reminisced about childhood days, no one laughed. Only the rhythmic clinking of spoons against ceramic bowls broke the quiet. Even neighbor Martha, who dropped by briefly to drop off an item, blinked in surprise at the frozen atmosphere. "You folks all look mighty grim tonight," she observed smoothly. "It has been a hard day's labor," Ethan answered flatly. "Well, it happens. Just make sure you guard each other fiercely," the neighbor warned, shaking her head knowingly, "because a wound inflicted by an outsider is easily healed, but a rift within a family festers forever." Her words carried an eerie weight of wisdom, though none of them had any inkling just how bitter the truth hidden behind them really was. That night, sleep abandoned Peter completely. He lay awake beside Nancy, his mind swirling not with thoughts of slashed shirts or bundles of straw, but with the terrifying prospect of losing his brother over petty malice and mutual distrust. And the very next morning, a brand new discovery waiting right by the front door would force even Ethan, the staunchest defender of Hannah's innocence, to harbor sudden gnawing doubts. At first light, Ethan woke up before anyone else. Following the bitter clash with his brother, his spirit felt deeply troubled. He stepped outside to fetch a bucket of well water and was about to pull open the heavy door of the storage shed when something strange caught his eye. Wedged directly into the thick wooden doorframe, right at eye level, was a rusted sewing needle. It wasn't merely dropped on the ground or lost in the dirt. It was forcibly driven straight into the seasoned wood, as if hammered there with malicious intent. Ethan frowned deeply, yanked the needle out of the timber, and turned it over and over in his powerful fingers. A minute later, Hannah stepped out into the crisp morning air. "What is wrong?" she asked, spotting his grim expression. "Take a look at this." Hannah went entirely white. "Where did you find that thing?" "Right here in the doorframe." She carefully took the needle from his hand. Following the straw, the salted flour, and the mutilated garments, this could no longer be dismissed as a random coincidence. Within the hour, the entire household was gathered around the table staring at the needle. Nancy looked at the small piece of metal as if it might spring to life and attack at any moment. "I told all of you someone is doing this on purpose," Peter demanded, slamming his fist on the table. "This has officially crossed every conceivable boundary." "If I knew who was responsible, I would have named them long ago," Hannah stated flatly. For the first time since the troubles began, Hannah experienced the exact same paralyzing terror that had gripped Nancy for weeks. Previously, she had convinced herself the younger woman was exaggerating out of paranoia. Now, virtually all doubt had evaporated. Midday came and went under a cloud of oppressive silence. Even hard physical labor offered no distraction. Nancy kneaded bread dough while constantly glancing toward the front door, while Hannah tended the brick stove with her mind miles away. And as evening shadows lengthened, yet another disaster struck. When Peter stepped into the storage shed to fetch a fresh sack of grain for the livestock, he immediately noticed that the bottom of one heavy burlap sack had been neatly sliced open, spilling precious wheat all over the packed earth floor. "Ethan!" he shouted out in dismay. The brothers inspected the ruined grain together. "Rats didn't do that," Ethan declared instantly. "The cut is far too clean." Peter remained grimly silent. Even he could no longer rationalize these events as freak accidents.
During supper, nobody touched their food. "This simply cannot continue any longer," Peter declared, breaking the heavy silence. "Someone is playing mind games with us, or actively trying to tear this family apart," Hannah added quietly. Nancy lifted her eyes to meet Hannah's gaze. It marked the very first time in weeks that the older woman hadn't reflexively dismissed the obvious. "You think so too?" Nancy asked softly. "Yes." Nancy wanted to fire back a sharp retort, but swallowed the words. Deep inside her heart, the absolute certainty that Hannah was the sole culprit developed its first tiny fracture. If the older woman was genuinely just as terrified as she was, could Hannah really be the mastermind behind these bizarre attacks? Late that night, neighbor Martha dropped by unannounced for a brief moment, bringing along a small bundle of dried mint leaves and blinking in genuine surprise at the gloomy, hollow faces of the household. Ethan briefly recounted the discovery of the needle and the slashed grain sack. The neighbor listened intently, her face tightening into a mask of solemn sympathy, before slowly shaking her head. "Bad business. This is very bad business indeed." "Well, what are we supposed to do about it?" Nancy pleaded. "Keep your guard up, stay vigilant, and above all, stop fighting among yourselves," the neighbor advised solemnly. "Evil loves nothing more than a home where people stop trusting one another." After she departed, the family sat in heavy, unbroken silence for a long time. Her words hit home, yet trust within the farmhouse was at an all-time low. That night, awakened by a faint, suspicious scratching sound drifting in from the farmyard, Hannah made a fateful decision. Instead of rolling over and pulling the quilt over her head, she was going to get up, peer out the window, and catch whoever was sneaking around their homestead after dark. Sleep eluded Hannah for hours that night. Following the terrifying discovery of the sewing needle and the slit grain sack, an oppressive tension gripped the farmhouse, one far worse than anything experienced even during Martha Peterson's final days of illness. Everyone had grown hyper-vigilant, watching every move the others made, letting the mutual trust their matriarch had preached melt away with every passing sunrise. Well past midnight, a faint, rhythmic rustling noise outside snapped Hannah back to full alertness. At first, she assumed it was merely the wind stirring the heavy branches of the old apple tree near the fence, but the sound repeated itself. It sounded distinctly like cautious, muffled footsteps treading softly across the dirt, trying hard to avoid making a sound. Hannah propped herself up on her elbows and strained her ears. Her heart slammed frantically against her ribs. She instantly recalled Nancy's earlier descriptions of a nocturnal shadow lurking near the storage shed, and for the first time she admitted to herself that the younger woman might have been telling the exact truth all along. Quietly sliding off her sleeping bench, Hannah crept across the creaking floorboards toward the small window pane. Outside, pitch-black darkness reigned, broken only by a pale sliver of moonlight washing over the dusty farmyard. For a moment, she saw nothing at all. Then, a dark, hunched silhouette detached itself from the shadows near the storage shed. Someone was crouching low against the wooden wall, frantically digging or hiding something in the dirt. Hannah froze, her breath catching in her throat. She desperately wanted to call out for Ethan, but the mysterious figure abruptly stood up and began creeping swiftly along the wooden fence line. In a matter of seconds, the intruder vanished into the deep shadows of the orchard. Hannah lingered by the window for a long time, but no further movement materialized. Dawn was still hours away when she finally drifted into a restless doze, and the moment the first morning light painted the sky, she resolved to investigate the spot. Right against the exterior wall where the stranger had crouched the night before, she discovered a tiny bundle of straw, bound tightly with a coarse black thread. Hannah felt an icy wave wash over her. All skepticism was gone now. Someone was orchestrating this campaign of terror with deliberate, chilling malice. Tucking the sinister bundle deep inside her apron pocket, she walked back inside the farmhouse. Throughout breakfast, Hannah remained completely mute. She decided against blurting out the news of the nocturnal prowler immediately, wanting to piece things together first.
But as the afternoon dragged on, her thoughts relentlessly circled back to the midnight apparition. Stepping outside after midday chores, she spotted neighbor Martha lingering by the front gate. The neighbor had stopped by to chat casually about upcoming garden harvests, acting entirely natural and unbothered. Nothing in her demeanor screamed suspicion. Yet this time, Hannah studied her with sharp, analytical eyes, not out of blind accusation, but simply because she was forcing herself to logically map out every single soul in the township who possessed intimate knowledge of their household's daily routines. Neighbor Martha visited constantly, witnessed every family quarrel, and eavesdropped on nearly every private conversation. The mere thought made Hannah feel instantly guilty, prompting her to mentally scold herself for entertaining such wild thoughts about her late mother-in-law's oldest friend. Still, the gnawing unease refused to vanish. That evening around the supper table, Nancy blurted out a cry of sheer desperation. "I simply cannot live in this constant state of terror any longer." Every head snapped up to look at her. "What are you talking about?" Peter asked, his voice laced with concern. "I mean that this nightmare never ends. First the straw, then the shirt, then the needle, now the grain sack. What on earth is going to happen next?" Nobody offered an answer because no one possessed one. And right at that exact moment, Hannah made up her mind. She would not sleep a wink tonight. If someone was brazenly sneaking onto their property under the cover of darkness, she was going to witness it with her own two eyes. Little did she know that this upcoming night would hurl her far closer to the horrifying truth than all the weeks of bitter quarrels and misplaced suspicions combined. The following day, Hannah acted as if nothing out of the ordinary had occurred. She hoed the garden beds, tended the livestock, prepared meals, and even exchanged a few genuinely warm remarks with Nancy, softening the sharp edges that had characterized their relationship for weeks. But beneath her calm exterior, her mind reeled with the image of the midnight prowler. For the first time, she wasn't merely driven by anger or wounded pride, she was hunting for the naked truth. When the sun dipped below the horizon, the brothers returned from the fields, their bodies aching with fatigue. Supper was a brief, subdued affair. Even Peter had largely abandoned his jovial banter, the accumulated stress of the household friction weighing heavily on everyone. Nancy looked perpetually haunted, Ethan wore a permanent scowl, and Hannah sat in deep, watchful silence. Only neighbor Martha dropped by for a quick evening visit, bringing a handful of fresh apples and inquiring solicitously about their well-being. "You folks really need to stop letting worry consume your minds," she advised smoothly. "Sometimes the fear of a disaster causes far more damage than the disaster itself." "If only this were merely a matter of fear," Nancy murmured bitterly. The neighbor offered a sympathetic pat on the shoulder, lingered a bit longer, and finally strolled back down the road toward her own cottage. Hannah watched her retreating figure all the way until she cleared the front gate. Once the household settled into sleep, Hannah deliberately kept herself awake. Waiting until absolute quiet descended upon the rooms, she quietly slipped off her sleeping berth and seated herself directly beside the small window. The moon shone significantly brighter tonight, casting a crisp silver glow over the entire farmyard. Hour after hour dragged by in dead silence. Hannah was just beginning to suspect she had wasted her entire night when a sudden movement near the fence line caught her eye. Her heart hammered against her ribs with the force of a battering ram. Someone was out there in the dark. The dark silhouette moved with agonizing slowness, constantly pausing to scan the yard before finally slipping toward the storage shed. Hannah held her breath. The intruder dropped into a crouch against the wooden wall, frantically fumbling with something in their hands.
Unable to contain herself another second, Hannah threw a woolen shawl over her shoulders and slipped silently out the rear exit. The spring ground was freezing beneath her bare feet, but she barely felt the chill as she crept stealthily toward the shed. The rustling noise suddenly stopped. The prowler snapped upright, sensing movement in the dark, and bolted toward the orchard. "Stop right there!" Hannah cried out, breaking cover. The fleeing figure sprinted blindly into the dark. Hannah chased after them, her lungs burning, but she was far too old and slow to match their pace. Within moments, the mysterious intruder melted completely into the black shadows of the trees. Panting heavily, she stumbled back to the storage shed. Lying right against the base of the timber wall was a fresh, tightly bound zerg of straw tied with the familiar black thread, an exact duplicate of the items that had plagued their home for weeks. She snatched it up, her fingers gripping the straw with fierce determination. Zero doubts remained now. Every single act of sabotage had been engineered by one single individual. But who? Returning inside the farmhouse, Hannah lay wide-eyed until dawn pierced the eastern sky. The moment morning broke, she made the momentous decision to reveal everything to Nancy. And that single conversation would shift the foundation of trust between the two women far more profoundly than all their previous weeks of toxic warfare. Early that morning, Hannah woke Nancy up before the rest of the household stirred.
The memory of the midnight chase still raced through her veins. Pulling the hidden straw bundle from her apron pocket, she laid it out before the younger woman's eyes and recounted the entire episode. Nancy listened in stunned, wide-eyed silence. "So, you actually saw someone out there?" "With my own eyes, and now I know for an absolute fact that you weren't making any of this up." Nancy lowered her head, a profound wave of relief washing over her. For the first time in weeks, Hannah wasn't rolling her eyes or dismissing her fears. "I honestly thought I was losing my mind," Nancy whispered hoarsely. "And I honestly thought you were waging a malicious smear campaign against me," Hannah confessed with a rueful smile. Both women exchanged bitter, understanding grins. For the first time in their lives, they spoke with total, unfiltered honesty. "Hannah, you truly didn't slash that wedding towel, did you?" "Never. And you never poured salt into the flower bins?" "Never in my life." They stared deep into each other's eyes, and in that quiet dawn, absolute trust finally took root. After the midday meal, they sat down together and methodically catalogued every single malicious event. The straw bundles, the rusted needles, the salted flour, the slashed work shirt, the ruined wedding towel, the slit grain sack. The more they analyzed the pattern, the more glaringly obvious the truth became. Someone was expending an immense amount of malicious energy to drive a permanent wedge between them. "But who could possibly benefit from tearing our family apart?" Nancy wondered aloud, knitting her brow. "I don't know yet, but whoever it is knows the ins and outs of this homestead better than anyone else." That evening, when the brothers returned exhausted from the fields, Hannah and Nancy decided to keep their discoveries under wraps for just a little longer. They needed concrete proof. And after supper, both women silently agreed on a daring plan. "Tonight, we keep watch together," Hannah announced firmly. "Together?" Nancy blinked in surprise. "If whoever has been terrorizing us shows their face again, the two of us will corner them before they can vanish into the dark." Nancy offered a firm, resolute nod. When the house finally quieted down and everyone else retired to their beds, the two women stationed themselves side by the front window. Just a month earlier, neither of them would have believed it possible that they would ever sit cooperatively, waiting for the exact same threat to emerge from the shadows. The night crawled past at a snail's pace. The farmyard remained dead silent, save for a stray dog barking somewhere in the distant reaches of the township. Then, abruptly, Nancy nudged Hannah's arm sharply. "Look!" Down by the wooden fence line, a dark silhouette was gliding stealthily forward, heading directly toward the storage shed. Hannah and Nancy exchanged one final resolute glance. Their hearts pounded like war drums. Without making a single sound, they slipped out through the rear doorway into the crisp night air. Because tonight, the hidden truth was finally going to be dragged out into the blazing light. Catching sight of the prowler crouching near the storage shed, Hannah and Nancy paused for only a single breathless heartbeat. The intruder moved with practiced caution, clearly intimately familiar with the layout of the farmyard, suggesting this wasn't their first nocturnal visit. The silhouette knelt down by the exterior wall, fumbling with something concealed beneath the folds of a heavy woolen shawl.
"Now," Hannah hissed out. Nancy surged forward like a coiled spring, diving directly at the mysterious figure and grabbing a fistful of heavy woolen fabric before they could react. "Oh no, you don't! You aren't getting away this time!" The intruder let out a sharp gasp and thrashed violently, trying to shake her off, but Hannah lunged in from the opposite side, clamping both hands onto the person's other arm. A fierce, silent wrestling match erupted in the dirt. "Let go of me! Let go of me right now!" shrieked a familiar, high-pitched female voice. All three of them froze dead in their tracks. Nancy was the first to react, ripping the heavy woolen headscarf off the prowler's head with a violent jerk. "Neighbor Martha!" Complete, ringing silence descended upon the farmyard. Even the nearby crickets seemed to abruptly halt their chirping. Standing before them in the moonlight was the village neighbor, the exact same Martha who visited their homestead almost daily, offered profound sympathies, brought gifts of fresh fruit and dried healing herbs, and constantly preached the sacred importance of family harmony. Clutched tightly in her trembling, claw-like hands was a freshly fashioned zerg of straw, tightly bound in a crisscross pattern with thick black thread. Nancy stared at the older woman as if she were looking at a terrifying ghost from another realm. "It was you," Nancy whispered, the words barely audible over the wind. "You engineered every single one of these vile tricks." Neighbor Martha kept her mouth clamped shut in stubborn defiance. Hannah lunged forward and forcefully yanked the straw bundle right out of the neighbor's grip. "Straw, nothing but cursed straw again. So you were the one sneaking around our home like a common thief?" The neighbor slowly lowered her eyes to the dirt. For the first time, she no longer projected the image of a wise, benevolent village elder, but looked instead like a cornered culprit caught red-handed in a despicable crime. "Get inside the house right now," Hannah commanded, her voice ringing with hard authority. "And this time you are going to explain every single piece of this madness to all of us." Within minutes, the entire household had been dragged from their beds and gathered in the large farmhouse kitchen. Ethan and Peter rubbed the sleep from their eyes, utterly bewildered. But the moment they laid eyes on neighbor Martha sitting at the table alongside the incriminating straw bundle, their expressions darkened into thunderclouds. "What is going on here?" Peter demanded, his voice dropping an octave. "We just caught the person responsible for every single piece of sabotage plaguing our home," Nancy answered firmly. Peter slowly shifted his gaze from his wife to the neighbor, shaking his head in absolute disbelief. "No, that is impossible." Neighbor Martha sat frozen in total silence. "Well, are you going to explain what you were doing lurking around our storage shed in the middle of the night?" Ethan pressed, stepping forward. The elderly woman kept her eyes glued to the wood-grained tabletop for a long, agonizing minute before letting out a shuddering, ragged sigh. "I never intended for things to spiral this far out of control." "Well, they did spiral," Hannah snapped, her temper flaring. "Because of your malicious games, this family nearly tore itself apart into bitter enemies." Neighbor Martha slowly lifted her gaze to meet Peter's eyes. A deep, sorrowful shadow flickered across her weathered features, something ancient, bitter,
and painfully personal. It all started many years ago. Peter frowned deeply, crossing his arms over his chest. "What on earth are you talking about?" But neighbor Martha fell back into stubborn silence. It was blatantly obvious she had carried this agonizing secret bottled up inside her chest for decades, and now the crushing weight of reality left her with nowhere left to run. The kitchen grew so deathly quiet that the steady crackling of wood inside the brick stove sounded like roaring thunder. Nobody spared another thought for the straw bundles or the rusted sewing needles, because every single person in that room instinctively knew they were about to unearth the true root cause behind months of torment, and that this long-buried truth would prove infinitely older and more profound than any petty feud between two sisters-in-law. The silence inside the farmhouse kitchen remained so absolute that the snapping of dry pine inside the brick stove echoed loudly against the walls. Neighbor Martha sat rigidly at the head of the wooden table, staring steadfastly at her clasped hands. Resting directly in front of her lay the ominous bundle of straw bound tightly with black thread, the exact object Hannah had forcefully ripped from her grasp out by the storage shed. Standing nearby, Nancy leaned against the timber wall, her palms pressed flat against the rough wood as if steadying herself against an earthquake, while Peter and Ethan towered over the seated woman like stone monuments. Nobody could quite process the surreal reality of what had just transpired. Finally, Peter broke the agonizing spell of silence. "Why on earth were you skulking around our storage shed in the dead of night?" Neighbor Martha offered no immediate reply. "We are waiting for an answer," Ethan warned, his tone dangerously low. "I was simply passing by." Hannah let out a harsh, disbelieving laugh, lifting the straw bundle. "Passing by in the middle of the night with cursed straw in your hands?" The neighbor turned her face away toward the dark window pane. "You do not understand the situation." "Then enlighten us!" Ethan raised his voice, his patience finally snapping. "Because of these childish pranks and dark superstitions, our family spent months tearing at each other's throats." Neighbor Martha visibly flinched, but stubbornly kept her mouth shut. Nancy stepped forward, placing the slashed wedding towel, the ruined work shirt, and the straw bundle onto the table in a neat, tragic row. Were these all just a misunderstanding, too? The elderly woman let out a heavy, bone-deep sigh that seemed to deflate her entire body. "I never wanted to cause real harm." "And yet you did," Peter shouted, his face flushing crimson. "Because of your vindictive games, my wife lived in absolute terror inside her own home. Because of you, we stopped trusting one another. Because of you, my brother and I nearly became bitter strangers." Neighbor Martha finally lifted her weary eyes, and for the first time, total defeat mirrored in her gaze. She looked directly at Peter. "It all goes back to a promise made long before you ever left this village." Peter furrowed his brow, stepping closer. "What promise? Who made a promise?" The neighbor swallowed hard, her voice trembling. "Many years ago, your mother and I sat right at this very table and made an agreement. We always assumed, we truly believed, that when you grew to manhood, you would marry my Oksana." Peter froze dead in his tracks, his jaw dropping in shock. "My what? We were just children." "We spoke of it constantly as you boys grew up," the neighbor continued, her voice cracking with suppressed emotion. "It seemed so natural, so right. We dreamed that our two families would eventually merge into one." Nancy looked at her husband in sheer astonishment, but Peter merely shook his head vigorously. "I knew nothing about any of this." "Because nobody ever bothered to ask your opinion," neighbor Martha smiled bitterly. "We were foolish old women living in our own nostalgic daydreams." She paused, her breathing shallow. "When you packed up and left for distant work, I waited. First a year, then 2, then 5. I kept convincing myself you would eventually return and honor our hopes. And then news finally reached the village that you had married another woman. A tear finally spilled over her wrinkled eyelid and tracked down her cheek. My daughter wept for days, and that was the exact moment I allowed a bitter hatred for fate to take root in my heart. Nancy lowered her gaze. For a fleeting second, a pang of pity flickered inside her chest for the broken mother, but it was instantly swallowed by the stark horror of what that hatred had wrought. And that gave you the right to systematically destroy our family? No, not at first, neighbor Martha whispered hoarsely. The true venom didn't set in until after Martha Peterson passed away. When she fell gravely ill, I nursed her. I spent hours sitting by her cot, learning every corner of this homestead better than most of her own kin. Your mother entrusted me with watching over the farmyard when her own legs could no longer carry her. She wasn't afraid of dying. Her greatest terror was that her boys would become estranged, that her family would shatter the moment she closed her eyes. And when she finally drew her last breath, something inside me snapped. I convinced myself you would never truly come back to stay, that Ethan and Hannah would inherit the place alone, and then—
You arrived, Peter, bringing a young bride right into the house I had secretly envisioned for my own flesh and blood. She buried her face in her weathered hands, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. I watched the two of you settling in, and I simply could not accept it. At first I only wanted to stir up a little trouble, just enough friction to make the young couple pack up and look for a homestead elsewhere. I dropped the first straw bundle. When that didn't work, I tried another. Then I spoiled the bread dough, slashed the work shirt, ruined the wetting towel, slit the brain sacs. And before I even realized what I was becoming, I was completely trapped in my own wickedness, utterly unable to stop. Nancy felt a cold shudder ripple down her spine. Because of your spite, we nearly destroyed each other. I know, the neighbor wept openly. Because of me, the brothers nearly came to blows. Because of me, trust was poisoned. Neighbor Martha lifted her tear-stained face, and her gaze swept across the room, landing squarely on each of them. But do not place the entire blame on my shoulders alone. Everyone stared at her in stunned silence. What is that supposed to mean? Hannah asked defensively. If true trust had existed between the two of you from the very beginning, no amount of scattered straw could ever have turned you against one another, the neighbor stated simply. If you had simply sat down and talked honestly, instead of letting suspicion fester in the dark, my tricks would have failed instantly. And if these brothers had genuinely remembered the blood binding them together, they never would have allowed outside whispers to build an invisible wall between them. A crushing, suffocating silence descended upon the kitchen once more, because every single person in that room suddenly recognized the agonizing truth in her words. Nancy flashed back to her groundless accusations against Hannah. Hannah recalled her petty, jealous guarding of the farmhouse. Peter remembered his blind anger. Ethan recalled his bitter resentment toward his brother. That does not excuse what you did, Ethan said quietly, his voice devoid of anger, carrying only profound weariness. It does not excuse me at all, neighbor Martha agreed, nodding solemnly as she wiped her eyes with the corner of her shawl. And I offer no defense for my actions. I am merely speaking the naked truth. She cast one final lingering look toward the empty wooden corner where Martha Peterson had spent her final weeks, her voice breaking entirely. The most unforgivable part of all this is that I betrayed the memory of my dearest friend. She spent her entire life holding this family together with every ounce of her soul, and I nearly destroyed it all with my own 2 hands. Nobody offered a comforting word. No shouts rang out. Instead of the toxic tension of suspicion and accusation, a heavy, cleansing silence settled over the old farmhouse, the silence of absolute truth. And every single person in that room instinctively understood that the morning sun would decide whether this harsh reality became an irrecoverable wound or the miraculous birth of a brand new beginning for the entire household. Following that midnight confrontation with neighbor Martha, sleep eluded everyone in the farmhouse until dawn broke. Every single person lay awake wrestling with their own turbulent conscience.
Nancy replayed every vicious accusation she had hurled at Hannah. Hannah relived every bitter resentment she had harbored against Peter's return. Ethan agonized over his fractured bond with his brother. And Peter tortured himself with the horrifying realization of how close he had come to losing everything that mattered most due to outside malice and his own stubborn lack of trust. The moment the sun crested the horizon, the entire family gathered around the wooden kitchen table. Bathed in the warm, golden light of morning, the atmosphere felt profoundly still, stripped of all pretense. Finally, Nancy lifted her gaze to meet Hannah's eyes. "Please, forgive me." Hannah blinked in genuine surprise. "For what?" Nancy's voice trembled uncontrollably. "For everything. For assuming the worst of you, for suspecting you at every turn, for viewing you as a mortal enemy even when I didn't possess a shred of proof. I was so terrified of losing my own footing in this house that I completely blinded myself to the truth." Tears welled up in Hannah's eyes. She remained silent for a long, trembling moment before whispering, "You must forgive me as well, Nancy. I was no better. I was so terrified of losing the familiar rhythm of my life, so terrified of how Peter's return would upend my world, that I stopped seeing you as a human being and started seeing you exclusively as a dangerous threat." Nancy could no longer dam up her tears. She stood up from the wooden bench, walked around the table, and threw her arms tightly around Hannah's shoulders. "You know what the most frightening part of it all was?" Nancy choked out through her sobs. "At a certain point, I genuinely started fearing you more than I feared any outside stranger." Fresh tears tracked down Hannah's cheeks. "And I was terrified of you, Nancy, and now I am deeply, profoundly ashamed of myself." Both women wept openly. Not tears of bitter grief or lingering resentment, but the cleansing tears of immense, overwhelming relief. It felt as though an intolerable boulder they had carried chained to their hearts for weeks had finally cracked and tumbled away into the dust. Ethan and Peter watched the embrace in total silence. Then Peter slowly turned his head to face his older brother. "And you need to forgive me too." Ethan shook his head slowly, a faint, weary smile touching his lips. "There is nothing to forgive." "Yes, there is. I came back home because I missed my family, and then I nearly let a stranger's wicked lies drive a wedge between us." Ethan stood up, walked over, and pulled his younger brother into a fierce, bone-crushing hug. "The important thing is that we caught ourselves before it was too late." For one fleeting, miraculous moment, the farmhouse felt precisely as it had during Martha Peterson's lifetime, entirely stripped of suspicion, devoid of resentment, and cleansed of petty quarrels. Nobody touched the fields or the livestock until well past midday. They simply sat together around the table, sharing memories of their mother, reminiscing about the brothers' mischievous childhood days, and marveling at how perilously close they had come to throwing it all away forever. Weeks slipped by. Gradually, daily life settled into a harmonious, predictable rhythm. Neighbor Martha stopped visiting the homestead altogether. The overwhelming weight of shame made it impossible for her to look any of them in the eye ever again. Meanwhile, a genuine new chapter began within the walls of the old farmhouse. Nancy and Hannah no longer fought over the brick stove, the clay mixing bowls, or the vegetable patch. On the contrary, they consulted each other on nearly every domestic decision. When one baked sourdough bread, the other eagerly jumped in to knead the dough. When one walked down to the well for laundry, the other walked right beside her. They transcended the traditional roles of mere sisters-in-law, evolving into true, devoted sisters and confidants. If one experienced joy, the other was unfailingly the first to celebrate. If one faced hardship, the other stood shoulder to shoulder to weather the storm. Ethan and Peter reclaimed their unbreakable boyhood bond, working the land side by side, sharing jokes, recalling old escapades, and resolutely refusing to let trivial misunderstandings ever creep between them again. A year passed swiftly. The first new life arrived when Hannah gave birth to a healthy, robust baby, filling the homestead with joyful cries, and just a few months later, a second infant was born to Nancy. The household's joy knew no bounds. The old farmhouse, which had so recently stood on the brink of destruction amidst a storm of vicious suspicions and bitter feuds, now vibrated constantly with the sound of happy children laughing. The two toddlers grew up side by side like twins, taking their first uncertain steps across the packed dirt yard, chasing farm hens by the well, and playing joyfully beneath the leafy canopy of the gnarled apple tree. Often, Hannah and Nancy could be found sitting together on the low porch stoop, laughing out loud as they recalled the utterly trivial misunderstandings that had once nearly turned them into mortal enemies. Several more years drifted peacefully by. The timber farmhouse stood in the exact same spot. The brick stove remained unchanged. The storage shed held firm, and the garden yielded its rich bounty year after year. But the family residing within its walls had been utterly transformed.
Here, clay pots were no longer hoarded, firewood counts were forgotten, and not a single square foot of soil was ever argued over again. Once upon a time, two young women had fought fiercely over a hearth, a garden plot, and every corner of a farmyard. Now they shared only boundless joy, mutual labor, and an unyielding, fierce love for their large, united family. And had Martha Peterson somehow returned to witness them on that bright afternoon, she undoubtedly would have smiled with profound peace, knowing her final dying wish had finally come true. You can divide a wooden house and you can carve up tillable acreage, but true, abiding family love can never be shattered by anyone on earth.